This is my story. It is not a story of grand battles or heroic deeds, but of the slow, quiet erosion of a soul and the single, blinding flash of clarity that followed. My son, my only child, threw a glass of water in my face. It was not a playful splash. It was an act of dismissal, of utter contempt, delivered across a dinner table I had paid for in a house I had built for him, surrounded by a family whose very existence was a testament to my life's work. He did it because I asked for a second piece of bread. That was the price of my dignity. He thought it was the end of the conversation. He did not realize it was the end of his world. You see, after the shock, after the cold water dripped from my chin onto the shirt I had owned for 20 years, I did not shout. I did not rage. I simply made a decision, and what I did next, he never, ever saw coming. I must begin where all such stories truly begin, not with the final insult, but with the first promise. I was born into a world of calloused hands and aching backs. My father was a laborer, and his father before him. We did not own land. We worked it for others. We did not build houses. We carried the stones for them. My childhood was a tapestry of things I could not have. The warm coat in the shop window, the sweet cakes in the bakery, the simple luxury of a day without worry. I remember the constant gnawing hunger, not just for food, but for a life that was softer, a life where one's worth was not measured in sweat and exhaustion. I promised myself, as a boy shivering in a threadbare blanket, that if I ever had a child, he would never know that cold. He would never know that hunger. When my son Daniel was born, that promise became a sacred vow. Holding his tiny, perfect form in my arms, I felt a love so fierce it was a physical pain in my chest. I looked at his innocent face, his trusting eyes, and I swore to him silently that I would build a wall of sacrifice around him, a fortress to protect him from the hardships I had known. I would be the foundation, unseen and buried, upon which his comfortable life would be built. He would have everything, every opportunity, every comfort. All I asked for, in the quietest corner of my heart, was that one day, when my back was bent and my hands were gnarled, he would remember the man who laid the stones. I thought that was a fair trade. I was a fool. The sacrifices began small, almost unnoticeable. When he was 6, he needed a new school uniform, the proper one, with the school's crest embroidered on the pocket, not the cheap imitation from the market. It was an expense we could not afford. My wife, his mother, was a worrier. She saw only the numbers that did not add up. I saw only the shame in my son's eyes if he were the only one in the wrong clothes. For 3 weeks, I told her I was eating lunch with my colleagues at work. Instead, I would find a quiet park bench and drink water from the public fountain, my stomach twisting into a tight, angry knot. I would imagine the taste of bread, the warmth of a simple soup. But then I would imagine Daniel, standing tall and proud in his new uniform, and the hunger would recede. When I brought the uniform home, he beamed. He never asked how I bought it. He just took it. That was the first stone I laid in the foundation. As he grew, the stones became larger, heavier. When he was 14, all his friends had bicycles. They would race through the streets after school, their laughter echoing as Daniel watched from our doorstep. He never complained, but I saw the longing in his face, a quiet sadness that was more painful to me than any open demand. That year, my own father had passed away, leaving me his old silver watch. It was not a valuable piece to anyone else, but to me, it was priceless. It was the one fine thing he had ever owned, a symbol of a lifetime of labor. I could feel the worn leather of the strap, see the fine scratches on the crystal. It was my only connection to him. I took it to a pawn shop. The man behind the counter, with eyes that saw everything and valued nothing, gave me a fraction of what it was worth to my heart. It was enough. The next day, a gleaming new bicycle was waiting for Daniel. He whooped with joy. He spent the entire afternoon riding it, a king of the neighborhood streets. I watched him from the window, my wrist feeling strangely bare and light. He was happy. I told myself that was all that mattered. I thought my sacrifices were investments in love. I believed that each act of self-denial was a deposit into a bank of future gratitude. When he wanted to go to university, a thing no one in our family had ever dreamed of, I took a second job, working nights, cleaning office buildings. My days were spent at the construction site, my nights with a mop and a bucket. I aged a decade in those 4 years. My body, already weary from a life of hard labor, began to break down. My back was a constant searing pain. My hands, swollen and stiff. I would come home in the early hours of the morning, the smell of chemical cleaner clinging to my clothes, and I would sleep for a few precious hours before heading back to the dust and noise of the construction site. Daniel would call from the university, complaining about the food in the cafeteria or the difficulty of an exam. I would listen, offer words of encouragement, and never once mention the exhaustion that was seeping into my very bones. I was the silent, tireless engine powering his ascent. When he graduated, he brought home his girlfriend, Sarah. She was from a family with money, a family that had never known a day of labor. She looked at our small, worn apartment with a polite, vacant smile that did not reach her eyes. I saw the way Daniel's shoulders tensed, the flicker of shame in his expression as he looked at our faded furniture and patched-up walls. He wanted to impress her, to belong in her world. A few months later, he told me they were getting married. He wanted a proper wedding, he said. Something nice. I knew what that meant. It meant something I could not afford. That night, I sat at our small kitchen table with my bank book. The savings I had painstakingly built over 30 years, the money I had set aside for my own retirement, for the day my body would finally refuse to work anymore, stared back at me. It was my future. It was my peace of mind. I took it all. The wedding was beautiful. Sarah wore a dress that cost more than my car. Their friends drank expensive champagne and laughed loudly. Daniel stood at the altar, looking handsome and successful. He gave a speech and thanked his new in-laws for their generosity. He mentioned me only once, a brief, passing acknowledgment. I stood at the back of the hall, a stranger at the feast I had paid for. The final great sacrifice was the house. After the wedding, they lived in a small apartment, and Sarah was not happy. She would make subtle comments about her friends' homes, their gardens, the space they had. Daniel, eager to please her, became obsessed with buying a house in a good neighborhood with a yard for their future children. He had a good job, but he had no savings. He had never been taught the discipline of saving because I had always been his safety net. He came to me, not as a son asking for help, but as a business partner outlining a problem. He had found the perfect house, but the down payment was astronomical. He presented the problem to me as if it were my own. "We can't get the loan without a huge down payment," he said, his tone implying that I was somehow responsible for solving this. I had nothing left. The retirement fund was gone. My savings were gone. All I had was the small house my wife and I had finally paid off after a lifetime of scrimping, the house where Daniel had grown up. It was our only asset, the final brick in our own humble shelter. But I looked at my son, and I saw not the man he had become, but the boy who had longed for a bicycle. I saw the child I had sworn to protect from want, and so I did the unthinkable. I mortgaged our home. I took every penny of equity we had and gave it to him for the down payment on his. I signed the papers with a hand that trembled not from age, but from a deep, primal fear. I was surrendering my last bastion of security. Here was my fatal mistake, the error in judgment that would lead to my eventual humiliation. When I gave him the money, the bank manager, a kind man who had known me for years, suggested a path of caution. He advised me to structure it as a loan, to have legal papers drawn up. I refused. "He is my son," I said, as if that explained everything. The manager then suggested that because of the size of the funds and Daniel's new, more complex financial life, we should set up joint accounts. He explained it was a way for me to help Daniel manage his finances, to guide him. Daniel agreed enthusiastically. It made things easier, he said. So we did. My name was on everything. The main checking account into which his salary was paid, the savings account where the remnants of my life's work sat, the investment portfolio I had funded. Legally, it was all mine. Morally, I believed it was ours, but with the unspoken understanding that it was his to use, and my name was merely a formality, a relic of my initial contribution. I thought I was creating a partnership. I did not understand that in his eyes I was simply signing over my kingdom and then making myself a ghost within its walls. I trusted him completely. That was my greatest sacrifice. My wife passed away 2 years after they bought the house. Her death left a silence in my life that was deafening. I was alone in my mortgaged home, the echoes of her laughter replaced by the ticking of a clock. Daniel and Sarah, in a gesture that seemed kind at the time, insisted I move in with them. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad," Daniel said. "There's plenty of room." I was grateful. I saw it as the fulfillment of my lifelong dream, to be cared for in my old age by the son I had given everything to. I sold my house, paid off the mortgage I had taken for him, and gave him the remaining profit. It was a substantial sum. I thought it was a final gift. Instead, it was my entry fee into a life of servitude. I moved into the small guest room in the basement of the house I had bought. The foundation had moved upstairs, and I, the cornerstone, was relegated to the cellar. The disrespect did not start overnight. It was a slow leak, a gradual poisoning of the air. At first it was subtle things. When I would tell a story from my past, a story of the hardships I had overcome, Daniel would glance at his phone, his attention clearly elsewhere. He would nod absently, his face a mask of polite boredom. Sarah would find a sudden, urgent reason to be in another room. My words, once the bedrock of his world, were now just the ramblings of an old man. They were an inconvenience, a tiresome soundtrack to their busy, important lives. I told myself I was being too sensitive. They were young. Their lives were full. I was a relic from another time. Then it became more overt. It began with sighs, a loud theatrical sigh from Daniel whenever I asked for a small favor. Could he drive me to a doctor's appointment? A deep sigh, a check of his watch. I'm really busy this week, Dad. Can't you take a bus? The bus stop was a mile away, and my arthritis made walking a painful chore. I had bought him his first car, a gleaming sedan, by selling my own older, reliable vehicle and adding my savings. He seemed to have forgotten that. The memory of my sacrifice had been paved over by the asphalt of his own self-importance. I started taking the bus. Sarah's disdain was sharper, wielded with a surgeon's precision. It was in her tone when I accidentally spilled a drop of water on the kitchen floor. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she would mutter, grabbing a paper towel with a look of extreme irritation, as if I had deliberately vandalized her pristine home. She complained about the cost of my medication, a few dollars for the pills that kept my heart beating steadily. She would review the grocery bills and say, loudly enough for me to hear from the next room, "I don't know why the food costs so much. It's not like we're feeding an army." I was eating less than any of them, my appetite shrunk by age and a growing sense of being a burden. I was a line item on a budget, an unwelcome expense. The children, my grandchildren, learned from their parents. They were not malicious by nature, but they were excellent mimics. When I spoke, they would roll their eyes, a perfect imitation of their father. They would snicker when I moved slowly or struggled to stand up from a chair. Once, my grandson, only 8 years old, said to me, "Grandpa, you walk funny." He said it with the innocent cruelty of a child, but I saw Daniel and Sarah exchange a small, knowing smirk behind him. They were not correcting him. They were cultivating his contempt. They were teaching him that respect was conditional, and that I no longer met the conditions. I was becoming a caricature in my own family, the bumbling old man in the basement. Money became their favorite weapon. Daniel, who had never known a day of financial uncertainty, began to posture as the great provider. He would talk about his house, his investments, the crushing weight of his responsibilities. He conveniently forgot that the house stood on a foundation of my life savings, that the investments were seeded with the money from the sale of my own home. I had poured my entire financial existence into his, and he had simply absorbed it, rewriting history to cast himself as the self-made man. He was living in a house of cards built with my money, and he had the audacity to complain about the cost of the deck. One evening, he sat at the dinner table, sorting through bills. "It just never ends," he said, shaking his head. "Mortgage, utilities, car payments. It's a lot of pressure, Dad. A lot of pressure to have everyone depending on you." He looked at me, a flicker of accusation in his eyes. He was not speaking to me. He was performing for Sarah, reinforcing the narrative of his own magnanimity and my burdensome presence. The injustice of it was a physical weight in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to list every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every meal I had skipped. I wanted to hold up the ghost of my father's watch and ask him what it was worth. But I said nothing. I had learned that my silence was the price of peace, however fragile. I would retreat to my basement room, the unspoken words a bitter acid in my throat. I chose to endure the private humiliation to avoid a public family war. I thought my patience was a form of strength. I was wrong. It was permission. The public face was a masterpiece of deceit. To their friends, to the neighbors, Daniel was the dutiful son. "Of course we had my dad move in," he would say, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I couldn't bear the thought of him being alone after Mom passed. Sarah would nod, a beatific smile on her face. He's a joy to have around. The kids just adore him. They would paint a picture of a loving, multi-generational family, a portrait of domestic bliss, and their friends would praise them for their kindness, for their generosity. "You're such good people," they would say. This hypocrisy was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. My humiliation was their social currency. They were cashing in on a compassion they did not possess, using my silent suffering as proof of their virtue. I was a prop in the play of their perfect life. The day it all shattered began like any other. It was a Sunday. Daniel had grilled steaks in the backyard of the house I'd bought him. The smell of charcoal filled the air. We were all sitting around the large, polished dining table he and Sarah had picked out. The grandchildren were bickering. Sarah was scrolling through her phone. Daniel was holding forth about some minor triumph at his office, the master of his domain. I was sitting at my usual spot at the end of the table, feeling more like a distant observer than a member of the family. The meal was served. I received a small piece of steak, mostly gristle, and a spoonful of potatoes. I ate slowly, trying to make it last. The others had already finished their generous portions and were helping themselves to more. I was still hungry. It was a simple physical fact. The gnawing hunger I remembered from my childhood, a feeling I had worked my entire life to banish, was back. It was a ghost sitting at the table with me. I hesitated for a long moment. I knew that any request was a potential spark in a room full of gasoline. But I was hungry. After a lifetime of providing, of ensuring my son never knew this feeling, I was the one left wanting at his table. I waited for a pause in his monologue. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet, almost timid, "could I please have another piece of bread?" He stopped talking. The entire table fell silent. He turned his head and looked at me, not with annoyance, but with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look you might give to an insect you found crawling on your plate. He stared at me for a long, cold moment. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "Another piece of bread?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He made it sound like the most outrageous, unreasonable request in the world. He looked at Sarah, who raised her eyebrows in a perfect, synchronized expression of contempt. He was playing to his audience. He was about to perform. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips, "that's the problem with your generation. You always want more. You take, and you take, and you take." He picked up his large glass of ice water. The condensation dripped onto the polished wood of the table. "You live in my house, you eat my food, and still you want more." My mind reeled. His house, his food. The words were so profoundly untrue, so monumentally unjust, that I couldn't even form a response. I just stared at him, my heart pounding in my ears. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose life I had built from the marrow of my own, was erasing me, negating my entire existence with a few casual, brutal lies. And then he did it. With a flick of his wrist, a gesture of casual, absolute power, he threw the contents of his glass at me. The ice cubes struck my chest with a dull thud, and the cold water splashed across my face, my hair, my shirt. It dripped from my nose and my chin. It was a baptism of contempt. For a split second, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from my face onto the floor. I did not flinch. I did not wipe the water away. I just sat there, frozen, looking at him. The reaction of the others was the final nail in the coffin of my love for him. Sarah let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. She covered her mouth, but her eyes were dancing with amusement. She found it funny. My humiliation was entertainment. The children just stared, their eyes wide, not with horror, but with a kind of morbid curiosity, as if they were watching a particularly interesting scene in a movie. No one rushed to help me. No one chastised him. No one offered me a napkin. Their silence was not shock. It was complicity. In that moment, I was utterly, completely alone. I was not a father, not a grandfather. I was an object of ridicule, a thing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the cold water seeping into my shirt, chilling my skin. But beneath the chill, something else was happening. A fire was being lit. The years of accumulated hurt, the thousands of small cuts, the constant grinding erosion of my dignity had been compressed into this one singular moment. The water did not wash away my pride. It washed away my illusions. It washed away the foolish, sentimental love for a man who no longer existed, if he ever had. It washed away the patient, forgiving father, and left behind something cold, hard, and clear. I looked at Daniel's smug, arrogant face, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound and terrifying emptiness. The love had died. It had been murdered at his dinner table. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the floor was unnaturally loud in the silent room. I stood up, water still dripping from my gray hair. I did not look at any of them. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps steady. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I did not care. I walked down the stairs to my basement room, the dampness of my shirt clinging to me like a shroud. I closed the door behind me and locked it. The click of the lock was a final, definitive sound. It was the sound of a door closing on my old life. Inside my small, dark room, I did not cry. I did not rage. I walked to the small, cracked mirror above the dresser, and I looked at myself. I saw an old man with a wet face and a soaked shirt. I saw the tired lines around his eyes, the deep grooves of a life of labor and disappointment etched into his skin. For years, I had seen weakness in that reflection. I had seen a man who endured, who forgave, who kept the peace at any cost. But now, for the first time, I saw something else. I saw the flicker of that fire deep in my eyes. The water had not extinguished it. It had been the fuel. Patience had been mistaken for weakness. Forgiveness had been mistaken for stupidity. My silence had been mistaken for consent. That all ended now. The debt of gratitude had been called in and refused. It was time to call in a different kind of debt. As I stood there, shivering slightly, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was the memory of the bank manager all those years ago, the memory of signing papers, the memory of my name, my legal signature being placed on every account, the checking account, the savings account, the investments. Daniel, in his arrogance, had never bothered to change it. Why would he? He saw the money as his and me as a harmless, irrelevant old man. He had no idea that the ghost in his financial machine held all the power. The foundation he believed he was standing on was, in fact, still legally mine. I had built his world. I could unbuild it. A plan began to form in my mind, not born of hot-headed revenge, but of a cold, surgical precision. This would not be a shouting match. It would not be a confrontation. Confrontation was his weapon, his arena. He thrived on dominance, on breaking others down with words and cruelty. My retribution would be silent. It would be total. It would be a simple act of removal. I would not destroy him. I would simply take back what was mine and let the edifice of his life collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. He had thrown water in my face. I would drain the ocean beneath his feet. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I moved with a quiet purpose I had not felt in years. The aches in my joints seemed to have vanished, replaced by a strange, humming energy. I dressed in my best, albeit old suit. I found my old briefcase, dusty in the back of the closet. I did not make a sound. I slipped out of the basement and out of the house while they all slept upstairs, dreaming their dreams of entitlement. The air outside was cool and clean. It felt like the first breath of a new life. I walked the mile to the bus stop, and the pain in my knees was a distant, unimportant thing. The bank opened at 9 o'clock sharp. I was the first person there. I sat down with the current bank manager, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. I explained the situation calmly and clearly. I presented my identification. I was the primary account holder. I had sole, unrestricted authority over all the associated funds. She checked her system, her eyebrows raised slightly. She looked from the screen to me and back again. "Yes, Mr. Williams," she said. "Everything appears to be in order. The accounts are solely in your name. What would you like to do?" "I want to do 3 things," I said, my voice even and steady. "First, I want to withdraw the maximum amount of cash allowed. Second, I want to wire the entire remaining balance of the checking, savings, and investment accounts to a new account, in a new bank, in my name only. Here's the information." I slid a piece of paper across the desk. I had opened the new account online the night before. "Third," I continued, "I want to close all of these existing accounts effective immediately." The manager looked at me, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She saw not just a transaction, but a story. She did not ask questions. She simply nodded. "I can take care of that for you, Mr. Williams." It took less than an hour. With a few keystrokes and a few signatures, 30 years of my son's life was erased. The salary that was due to be deposited in 2 days would have nowhere to go. The automatic payments for the mortgage, the car loans, the credit cards would all fail. The vast sum of money, the money from my retirement, from the sale of my house, from my entire life's work, flowed silently from his world back into mine. The manager counted out the cash for me, a thick stack of bills that I placed in my briefcase. When it was all done, she handed me the final paperwork. "It's complete," she said. I stood up and shook her hand. "Thank you," I said, and I walked out of the bank. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the world seemed brighter. My next stop was a small travel agency. I walked in and booked a one-way ticket to a country by the sea, a place I had always dreamed of visiting, but had never allowed myself to imagine as a reality, a place where the cost of living was low and the sun was warm. The flight was that very evening. I paid in cash. The ticket was my declaration of independence. From there, I went to a small, discreet law office. I explained to a lawyer what I needed, a simple service. He was to hold a letter for 3 weeks and then mail it to my son's address. I paid him in cash for his time and services. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing one last thing. I went to a department store. I bought a new suitcase. I bought new clothes, simple, comfortable things. A few shirts, a few pairs of trousers, a good pair of walking shoes. I bought a new coat, a warm one. I did not look at the price tags. For the first time in my life, I bought what I wanted, not what I could afford. It was a strange, liberating feeling. I took a taxi back to the house, arriving in the mid-afternoon. Sarah's car was in the driveway. I let myself in through the basement door, my heart calm and steady. I could hear them upstairs, the television on, the sound of the children playing. They had not even noticed I was gone all day. I was so irrelevant that my absence was invisible. In my room, I packed my new suitcase. I put in my new clothes. I packed the few sentimental things I had left. A photograph of my late wife, a small book she had loved. I left behind everything else, the old clothes, the worn-out shoes, the threadbare towels. I left behind the ghost of the man who had lived in that room. When I was done, I placed my old empty wallet on the dresser. I took the new one I had bought and filled it with a portion of the cash from my briefcase. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I waited for the house to fall silent, for the rhythms of their life to lull them into a false sense of security. Around 2 in the morning, I stood up. The house was dark and quiet. I picked up my single suitcase and my briefcase. I did not look back at the room. I walked up the basement stairs, my steps making no sound. I walked through the dark kitchen, past the dining room, where my life had been irrevocably changed. I could almost see the ghost of myself sitting there, water dripping from his face. I paused at the front door. I put my key to the house on the small table in the entryway, a final act of severance. I opened the door, stepped out into the cool night air, and closed it gently behind me. I did not slam it. I simply clicked it shut. I walked down the driveway, my suitcase rolling quietly behind me, and I did not look back. I was a free man. I can only imagine the scene the next morning. I have played it in my mind, not with anger, but with a kind of detached, clinical curiosity. I imagined Sarah going to the grocery store, her cart full of the expensive organic food she favored. She would get to the checkout, her phone pressed to her ear, barely acknowledging the cashier. She would tap her card. "Declined," the cashier would say. She would tap it again, a flicker of annoyance on her face. "Declined." She would try another card, the joint credit card. "Declined." A flush of anger and embarrassment would creep up her neck. She would call Daniel, her voice a sharp, accusing hiss. "What's wrong with the cards?" I imagined Daniel sitting at his important desk, in his important office. He would be irritated by her call. He would condescendingly tell her she must have entered the wrong PIN. He would log into the online banking portal to prove her wrong, and then he would see it. The zeros. Account balance, 0. Savings account, 0. Investment portfolio, account closed. A wave of cold confusion would wash over him. A mistake. It had to be a bank error. He would call the bank, his voice full of the arrogance of a man who has never been told no, and the polite voice on the other end of the line would inform him that the accounts had been closed. They had been closed by the primary account holder, Mr. Williams, his father. The confusion would then curdle into panic. He would try to call me. The phone would go straight to voicemail because I had thrown the SIM card into a trash can at the airport. He would race home, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and fury. He and Sarah would search the house. They would find my basement room empty, my old clothes gone, my presents erased, the empty wallet on the dresser, the house key on the table by the door, and then the dawning, sickening realization it was not a mistake. It was an action. It was a consequence. The old man, the feeble, silent, irrelevant old man, had done this. The rage would come next. A volcanic, impotent fury. He would shout. He would throw things. He, who had never known a moment of real financial hardship, would now be facing a mountain of it. The mortgage payment was due. The car payments were due. The credit card bills were maxed out. The entire glittering structure of his life, which he believed he had built, was revealed to be a hollow shell. He had not been the provider. He had been a tenant, and the landlord had just evicted him. His power, his status, his wife's respect, his children's comfort, it was all predicated on money he had not truly earned. And now it was gone. His arrogance had no foundation to stand on. He was left with nothing but the consequences of his own cruelty. 3 weeks later, as I was sitting at a small cafe overlooking the turquoise sea, sipping a coffee I had bought with my own money, a letter was being delivered to his house. My lawyer had followed my instructions perfectly. The letter was not long. It did not contain recriminations or a litany of my sacrifices. That would have been an invitation to an argument, and I was done with arguments. My message was simple, cold, and final. It contained only 2 sentences. You threw water in my face when I asked for a piece of bread. I have decided to take back all the bread, and the water too. Do not try to find me. That note, I imagine, was the final blow. It connected his small, casual act of cruelty directly to the catastrophic, life-altering consequence. It was not an act of God. It was not a bank error. It was a response, an equal and opposite reaction. He had taught me a lesson about my worth in his eyes, and I had simply returned the favor. He had shown me that our relationship was transactional, so I had completed the transaction. He had valued me at less than a piece of bread, so I had left him with nothing. His pride, his arrogance, his contempt, it had all cost him everything. My new life is quiet. It is simple. I have a small, clean apartment with a balcony that looks out over the water. I spend my days walking along the beach, feeling the warm sun on my face. I read books. I sit in cafes and watch the world go by. I speak to people, strangers, who are kind for no reason other than shared humanity. The money, the substantial sum that I took back, sits in a bank account, barely touched. It is not for spending. It is for security. It is the wall around my peace. I have learned that I do not need much to be happy. I just need to be respected, and since no one else would give me that, I gave it to myself. Sometimes I think of them. I wonder how they are surviving. I wonder if Daniel found a way to recover, or if his world truly collapsed. I wonder if he ever understood why I did what I did, or if he simply cast me as the villain in the story he tells himself. But the thoughts are fleeting, like clouds passing over the sun. They hold no emotional weight. The pain is gone, the anger is gone, the love is gone. All that is left is a vast, quiet, and peaceful detachment. I did not seek revenge in the heat of the moment. I simply served justice, cold and final. He did not lose his fortune because of a complex financial scheme or a market crash. He lost everything because he could not give the smallest, most fundamental thing. He lost it all for a glass of water. He could not give me respect, so I took back the world I had given him. And in doing so, I finally found my own.